Hey, today we're doing the 11.2 extension, which is the inverse of a function. So, learning goal, I will find the inverse of a function. So pretty straightforward there. The only big thing you need to know is what on earth the inverse of a function is. So when we're talking about an inverse, what we are doing is we're just switching the input and the output. So that's really all an inverse is. So with that being said, let's get going with our examples. Okay, so for this first example, we have a bunch of points. This is a relation. It's actually a function also. But we have a bunch of points here, and we want to find the inverse. So we literally just have to switch the x and the y values, because remember, the x value is the input, and an inverse is where you switch the input and the output. So if this is my in and this is my out, then the inverse would have 4, negative 6. I just switch the two. This one would be 2, negative 3. 0, 0 stays the same. This would be negative 2, positive 3. And this would be negative 4, positive 6. So I literally just switched the x and the y values for all these points. If you have it as a table, you can do the exact same thing. So here's the table, or a table, and you can see here that this is actually not a function, because 4 goes to negative 2, and 4 also goes to 2. So I have one input and two outputs, so this is not a function, but I can still find the inverse. And again, it's just by switching the input and the output. So my input will now be negative 2. My output would be 4. My input would be negative 1. My output is positive 1. 0, 0, 1, 1, and 2, 4. So I just switched my input and my output. So starting off, finding the inverse is super easy. If you're thinking about the domain and range then, the old domain will be the new range. The old range will be the new domain. So your domain and range are just flip-flopped also. So it's pretty straightforward. If we have a graph, or if we have a function, and its inverse is also a function, then we just call them inverse functions. So we will take a look at some of those and how you actually go about finding the inverse function. All right, so our function, remember we use f of x as function notation. Our function is 6 minus 4x. I want to find the inverse of f of x, graph f of x, and the inverse. So that negative 1 next to the f, it's written like an exponent, but that really means the inverse. So we're finding the inverse of this function. My first step is going to be to write it with a y instead of f of x. So y equals 6 minus 4x. And then really, from here, I just do what I was doing before. I switch my x and my y. X equals 6 minus 4y. And then what I want to do is I want to solve this for y. So I will subtract 6 from each side, so x minus 6 equals negative 4y. And then I divide everything by negative 4. So I could write that as 1/4 x plus 3/2 equals y. And then just to show that this is the inverse of above, I would write the inverse of x equals 1/4 x plus 3/2, and that should actually be a negative 1/4 x, so let's fix that real quick. So that's all there is to it as far as finding the actual function. And then you guys all know how to graph. This is very straightforward. My 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5, 6. There we go. So this isn't quite slope-intercept form. It would be negative 4x plus 6. So I start at 6. I'm going to go down 4 over 1, down 4 over 1. So here, oops, let's make that dot really big. This line is f of x. And then I'm going to graph my inverse. It's going to start at 3/2. I'm going to go down 1 over 1, 2, oops, down 1 over 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's going to look something like that. And that is my graph and its inverse. So again, I just switched, well, I wrote it as y equals, switched the x and y, and solved for y. And that was how I came up with the inverse for my function. And that's it. That's what this entire extension, sorry, I forgot the word. That's what the entire extension is. So you're just doing problems 1 through 15 on the extension, which are pages 558 to 559. So piece of cake. You guys can get started on that, and if you have any questions, make sure you let me know.